I will try to go quickly. I recognized my presentation was way too long like last night, and I've taken out huge chunks, so we're not going to learn about some of the minutiae of this simulation. But my name is Samantha Twietmeyer. I'm a teaching fellow in political studies, and I have taught the UN course 3 times, 2018, 19, and 20, and so twice in person. And then I had to shift to virtual learning. And this presentation will review, give you a sense of what the simulation is, how I had to adapt to the virtual learning environment, some of the challenges that arose from that adaptation, and some of the lessons and actual opportunities I have drawn from the experience for even going back to in-person. So really quick, I'm not going to go into these in detail, but the simulation has its own learning outcomes. And in particular, students should be engaging on a topic, and the topic does change, developing an understanding of complex negotiation within the power relations of the UN Security Council, experiencing the complexity of United Nations decision-making processes, and then practical skills of presenting and arguing positions and research findings. So those are the overarching goals of the simulation. Very much applying their learning from the previous course weeks. And so this is a very intense active learning strategy. It takes up almost 4 weeks of the course, 3 weeks actual intense simulation, and roughly 30% of class time. And if you take into account the pre-work, the assignments they submit prior to the end to the simulation, it's 30% of their entire class time, including their outside of class work. So it's a significant component of the course. There is pre-work to get their skills and knowledge in place before the negotiations. There's negotiation training. Then there are 6 classes of the actual negotiation itself, although the final class is usually just a vote on the final document and the major debrief for the whole simulation. I'm going to move fairly quickly through some things because of time. I want to get to the point. So these are some of the shifts I had to make in moving into the virtual space. If you want to talk to me about how to build an intense simulation design in person, that's a whole other presentation. For remote learning, there were pieces that I changed that were fairly significant. One was that in the original format, the groups had to produce a formal written background document that was heavily weighted. In the remote learning environment, I went to 2 smaller, more creative assignments. They could do infographics or videos or however they wanted to do it, because really the task was just to show that they had done the research on their role and on the topic. So it was more just a presentation that they'd done the legwork. So I removed the more formal component. Another major shift was Microsoft Teams. I'm going to go into that in detail in a minute. This involved a requirement of teaching more skill sets than I had in original versions of the course. So beyond just how to draft resolutions and negotiate, I actually also had to teach Microsoft Teams skills, time management skills. There was also questions about how we were going to dedicate the class time because of the asynchronous components of the course. We were only synchronous 1 of the 2 sessions every week. And this actually meant that a lot of the asynchronous work was unsupervised as opposed to the traditional format where I was always in the room while the simulation was occurring. So just heading into Microsoft Teams very, very briefly, some of the things that made it an advantageous platform over Zoom, even though all the students complained that we weren't using Zoom, was that it provided me this channel function where the students they all had access to different channels and they could move between them while we were in live calls, which meant that they could do sort of backdoor negotiations by leaving the main call and going into a caucus room. So that type of movement was something that no other platforms I had access to at the time could provide. Another advantage was the chat stream function and the document editing, meaning the groups could work on their own activities within the Teams environment simultaneously. The chats were also, some groups kept them private. Almost all groups opened the chats to me publicly by the end because they were trying to evidence their participation. That was a very confused conversation we were having, and they were worried I wasn't going to recognize the work they had done. And then another component that made Microsoft Teams really useful was the students were able to present their position statements through pre-recorded videos, and I was able to try and build out what is normally really important in an intense simulation, which is an environment where they feel like they are part of the United Nations. And that was much more difficult to create when they're sitting in their own bedrooms and kitchens than when I have them in a room and I can put all manner of paraphernalia around them to make them feel like they're at the United Nations. So I anticipated that there would be technical knowledge and learning problems. I anticipated there would be teamwork, burden sharing issues, because there always are. I anticipated less hands-on coordination from me and time consumption in the asynchronous pieces. One of the ways I tried to tackle the technical knowledge pre-learning was to try and encourage them to use Teams to do their teamwork. But generally, most students didn't, because they didn't know Teams, they weren't comfortable with it, so they did their pre-work on other platforms. This is something I highly recommend you put your foot down on, because they need to have that skill set, and if they're not using Teams, they won't have it. And then finally, I actually hosted the negotiation training day in Teams as a way to get everyone used to the system. It didn't entirely work. I'm going to just review some of the positive feedback before I get into the challenges. So issues and concerns were raised by students in the feedback I received around group work burden sharing. But unlike in the in-person class where the burden sharing complaints were, I was pulling more of the weight than others, it was actually the opposite. Students were very concerned that there were other students spending way more time than they were willing to dedicate, and that there would be a grade representation, and they were saying, I think I met the participation requirements, but other people were putting in way more time, particularly in my own group, and I'm uncomfortable with this. They also raised concerns with an availability to meet with schedules being asynchronous. So one of the problems with the course being, or with the simulation being this late in the semester, in the asynchronous world of remote learning, was that students had already adapted to a certain pattern and they were unable to shift in a way that was necessary to happen when the simulation hit. And too many places they were expected to be all at once made it very confusing, although I will note that is true of a real world negotiation. So there was an ask from students for more structure. So just a quick summary of some of the unanticipated challenges. Teams limitations and technical challenges were real. They delayed our simulation quite a bit because the first few days were really just us trying to figure out how to make it work. Time commitment in monitoring the activity of students. So my monitoring of participation was to watch all the different channels where they were posting, and it was a significant time commitment on my part, as opposed to walking around a classroom passively observing. Virtual pacing required a lot more structure. Teams were moving at very different paces. Some of the regional groups got their work done within a day. Other regional groups took multiple days. This made it more difficult to control. And as I said, skills and habits acquired by November, the remote learning schedules, preferences for Zoom, and an unwillingness to engage with the Teams environment were issues that I did not anticipate. Students did, although, have some positive responses, as they usually do, but in particular in the remote environment, they really appreciated getting to interact with their classmates extensively. And they were largely impressed by their fellow peers' commitment. The break in the monotony of the learning of the semester was appreciated by many, and the replacement of a final major writing assignment was appreciated by many, because it opened up time for them in other courses. Experiencing the barriers to UN negotiation that are introduced in the class in the previous weeks, and contextualizing the experience is always feedback that I get. So it's a very advantageous learning strategy in terms of its incorporation in the course. And the flexibility and options that were provided through the Teams platform, once the students were comfortable with it, they recognized and they appreciated as well, but they had some suggestions on how to work with Teams earlier on in the semester. So this is my last slide. I did okay, I think. So I'm just going to go over some of the changes that were made or challenges that happened due to the virtual learning experience that I want to take forward. So the first one is the creative pre-work. Instead of doing the formal document, it was 15%, it was a heavy weighted assignment. I did 2 5% infographics that were, or videos or whatever students wanted to do. This allowed students to engage in a lot more engagement in actually exploring the subject and their character, because they were less worried about the formal grading aspect of it. The level of passive observation that I usually relied on, walking around the classroom to see how they're doing and to monitor and make sure that they're all on the same page, needs to be supplemented in either format. So I didn't have passive observation in the virtual one at all, which was very problematic. But I do think that the mechanisms that I came up with to supplement my passive observation, like having students be a little bit more concrete in submitting the work they've done for the day every day, is something that I would integrate into the in-person one as well, so that it's not relying on my passive observation to actually control the simulation. Planning pre-learning for both environments in a much more extensive way. So obviously visiting the space and testing the tech earlier on was something I was already doing, but I need to do it more extensively. So this was definitely something that I would take forward, including I never actually had my students visit our learning space before we used it in the past, and I will do that in the future. And finally, the in-person teaching timeline for this type of simulation, remember that I'm teaching a very condensed one, can be more condensed in person than online. I think online it should have been distributed over more weeks, maybe run simultaneously to the course. But I do think that even in the in-person scenario where we can be more condensed and it has its advantages, a less condensed timeline is more flexible. And one thing we've learned over the last 2 years is building flexibility into your course to respond to student needs. So some consideration about how I might unpack the sort of intensity of the simulation in an in-person class might actually improve its enjoyment for students as much as the virtual one. So I know I went really fast through that. It was a complicated simulation experience. But thank you so much. I also, in this slideshow, have a ton of visuals of things. So if in the questions people want to know how I did certain things, I can go back to the slide. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions and discussion.